In a stunning announcement, President Trump posted on social media this morning that Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro has been captured and flown out of the country with his wife.
De la lealtad más absoluta.
It could mark a remarkable end to a repressive socialist regime that started in Venezuela back with Hugo Chávez in 1999. Maduro has been a wanted man in the U.S. over alleged narco-terrorism and drug charges, with a $50 million reward for information leading to his capture.
Special report. I'm Carissa Lawson in New York. The United States just attacked Venezuela's capital, hitting military facilities in the country. President Trump ordered this operation. There were multiple explosions in Caracas starting at around 2 a.m. local time. You can see the video here coming in. It shows low-flying aircraft in the city. This is the first U.S. military attack within the country.
Under the cover of darkness, the skies over northern Venezuela lit up with intense explosions and bright flares. Eyewitness videos captured massive secondary detonations near Higuerote Airport in Miranda State, reportedly from U.S. airstrikes striking military targets, including possible air defense systems and ammunition stockpiles that appeared to ignite in chain reactions. Reports quickly emerged of more than 20 coordinated attacks across the region, from Caracas to key ports and bases, plunging parts of the capital into darkness and chaos. In a stunning development, President Trump announced that elite Delta Force operators had captured Nicolás Maduro and his wife and flew them out of the country.
Is that him coming down the steps?
It's really tough to tell because it's so dark. I think this is going to be it right now. We'll watch the pictures. This is Stewart Airport, just north of New York City. There's an Air National Guard base there, as well as it looks like a picture.
Good night. Good night. Happy New Year.
The room is quiet when power decides it's been challenged. Not the silence of peace, the silence that follows a door closing somewhere far above your life. The silence that precedes consequences. In the early hours before dawn, radar screens glow. Aircraft sit fueled on runways. Names are spoken in briefings without emotion. Files are open that have been building for years. And at the center of those files is one man, Nicolás Maduro, a former bus driver who rose into the most powerful office in Venezuela, a political heir to a revolutionary myth, a president recognized by some nations, rejected by others, sanctioned, indicted, accused, protected, and targeted all at once. And at one point, according to official U.S. declarations, a man the United States wanted in custody, dead or alive, not said, but removed from the equation. This is not a story about a single leader. It is a story about how power chooses who's legitimate, who is criminal, and who becomes a problem to be solved from the air. History didn't disappear. It was rewritten. This is the broken truth. Welcome to the architecture of confrontation. Welcome to the long shadow behind Venezuela. Welcome to the Broken Truth Podcast. I'm your host, Garrett. Tonight, we trace who Nicolás Maduro really is, where he came from, how he rose, and why the most powerful military on earth authorized actions that push the world to the edge of open conflict. Because when airstrikes are authorized, it is never just about one man. It is about systems colliding. Before Nicolás Maduro became a global headline, before sanctions froze assets and indictments named him directly, he lived an ordinary life, shaped by class, labor, and resentment. He was born in Caracas in 1962, not into wealth, not into military pedigree, not into the elite families that historically ruled Venezuela. His early years unfolded in neighborhoods defined by instability and survival. He worked as a bus driver for the Caracas metro system. He organized labor. He learned how power feels from the bottom, not from books, but from friction. That matters. Because leaders shaped by grievance do not govern like leaders shaped by privilege. They govern like men who believe history owes them something. During the late 1980s and 1990s, Venezuela simmered. Oil wealth existed, but it did not trickle. Political corruption was open and normalized. The two-party system rotated power without changing outcomes. In 1989, The Caracazo riots exploded after economic austerity measures triggered mass unrest. Hundreds were killed. The social contract cracked. And into that crack stepped a military officer named Hugo Chávez. Chávez did not win power with a gun. He failed with one first. His 1992 coup attempt collapsed, but his televised surrender transformed him into a symbol. He spoke directly to the poor. He named enemies clearly. He promised dignity, sovereignty, and revenge against the old order. Maduro watched carefully. He joined Chávez's movement, not as a soldier, but as a political operator. Where Chávez was fiery and theatrical, Maduro was patient, ideological, and organizational. He traveled, he built alliances, he absorbed the language of anti-imperialism, socialism, and historical destiny. When Chávez won the presidency in 1998, Maduro entered the inner machinery of the Bolivarian Revolution. Foreign minister, National Assembly leader, international envoy, and most importantly, loyalist. In the revolutionary systems, loyalty matters more than competence because loyalty survives purges. By the time Chávez's health began to fail, the question was no longer if succession would happen, but who would control the legacy. Chávez chose Maduro, not through an election, through an anointment. In December 2012, Chávez appeared on television, visibly ill, and told the nation that if he could not continue, Nicolás Maduro was his chosen successor. It was a moment heavy with symbolism and inevitability. When Chávez died in March 2013, the revolution needed continuity more than democracy. Maduro won the subsequent election by a razor-thin margin. Allegations of irregularities followed immediately. Protests erupted. International observers raised concerns. But the machinery moved forward anyway. Power had changed hands, and almost immediately, the system began to fracture. Oil prices collapsed. Mismanagement compounded. Inflation spiraled into hyperinflation. Food shortages became structural. Millions fled the country. For Maduro, the crisis was not proof of failure. It was proof of siege. Because authoritarian systems require enemies to justify endurance. Venezuela had many. The United States, Western banks, sanctions, corporate sabotage, and internal traitors. Maduro did not present himself as a technocratic solving problems. He presented himself as a defender, holding the line against collapse engineered from abroad. This framing matters because it defines why what happened next became inevitable. If this investigation unsettles you, follow the Broken Truth podcast on the platform you're listening on. Leave us a 5-star review, share this episode, and comment your thoughts below. This story does not exist in isolation. It continues through those willing to look. By 2017, Venezuela had crossed a threshold. The opposition-controlled National Assembly attempted to curtail Maduro's authority. The Supreme Court, packed with loyalists, stripped the assembly of power. Protests filled the streets. Security forces responded with force. Deaths mounted. Images traveled globally. The international community fractured. Some governments recognized Maduro as a president. Others declared his rule illegitimate. Sanctions escalated, first targeted, then systemic. Oil revenues collapsed further. Financial access disappeared. And then something unprecedented happened. In 2019, the United States recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. This was not symbolic, it was operational. Assets were frozen, diplomatic recognition shifted. The message was clear. Nicolás Maduro was no longer viewed merely as an authoritarian leader. He was now framed as an illegitimate occupant of power. But legitimacy is not what triggers airstrikes. Criminality does. In March 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice unsealed indictments against Nicolás Maduro and senior Venezuelan officials, accusing them of narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and corruption. A bounty was announced, tens of millions of dollars for information leading to his arrest. This was extraordinary. Sitting heads of state are rarely treated this way by major powers. This was escalation into a different category. Not rival, not dictator, but criminal enterprise leader. What remains unclear is where legal pursuit ended and strategic pressure began, because alongside indictments came military movements, naval deployments in the Caribbean, intelligence operations, covert actions, and quiet authorizations that never made press conferences. The United States never formally declared war on Venezuela, but it prepared for the possibility of removing its leader by force. Official language spoke of counter-narcotics operations, of regional security, of protecting shipping lanes. But patterns suggest something more layered. When a government labels a leader criminal, it lowers the threshold for force. It reframes intervention, not as war, but as law enforcement. And law enforcement does not negotiate with suspects. By this stage, Maduro had entrenched himself deeply. The military leadership remained loyal, not out of ideology alone, but survival. Intelligence services were restructured. Foreign alliances with Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba intensified. Venezuela became a node in a wider geopolitical contest. Any move against Maduro risked igniting regional instability, yet planning continued. What exactly was authorized remains classified. What was rehearsed remains unconfirmed, but the intent was signaled clearly. Nicolás Maduro was considered removable. The unanswered question is why that line was drawn so starkly, and why, ultimately, it was not crossed. The question sits at the heart of modern power projection, because sometimes the threat of force accomplishes what force itself cannot, and sometimes it reveals the limits of even the most powerful nation on Earth. We are not finished. This story deepens into covert operations, failed incursions, shadow negotiations, and the quiet realization that regime change is easier to plan than to execute. Stay with this investigation. Follow the Broken Truth podcast on the platform you're listening on. Leave us a 5-star review. Share this episode and comment your thoughts below. The silence after power decides has not ended. It is still listening. The moment the United States labeled Nicolás Maduro a criminal, the rules changed. Quietly, but permanently. Because criminalization is not just legal language. It is strategic permission. It allows intelligence agencies to operate differently. It allows military planners to frame scenarios without the constraints of diplomacy. It allows the idea of capture, removal, or neutralization to exist without ever saying the word assassination. And it forces the target to respond in kind. From this point forward, Maduro no longer governed as a president trying to stabilize a collapsing economy. He governed as a man convinced that his removal was not hypothetical, but scheduled. The state became paranoid, and paranoia became policy. Inside Venezuela, power consolidated rapidly. Opposition figures were arrested or driven into exile. Media outlets were silenced or absorbed. Courts ceased to function as independent institutions. Elections continued, but their outcomes were no longer in question. This was not ideological socialism anymore. It was regime preservation. To understand why the United States escalated so aggressively, you have to step outside Venezuela and look at the broader architecture. Venezuela sits atop the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. For decades, that oil flowed primarily through US-aligned markets. The Bolivarian Revolution disrupted that relationship, redirecting energy partnerships toward geopolitical rivals. At the same time, Venezuela became a corridor. Drug trafficking routes from Colombia and beyond passed through Venezuelan territory toward the Caribbean and West Africa. Corruption within state institutions was not speculative. It was documented by defectors, intercepted communications, and international investigations. But here's the uncomfortable layer. Many states tolerate corruption. Many states tolerate authoritarianism. Few become priority targets. What elevated Venezuela was its alignment. Maduro did not merely oppose U.S. policy. He openly invited adversarial powers into the Western Hemisphere. Russian military advisors arrived. Chinese financial lifelines extended. Iranian fuel shipments docked openly during sanctions. Cuban intelligence embedded itself deep within Venezuelan security services. From Washington's perspective, this was not just a failing state. It was a hostile platform forming in the U.S. strategic backyard. And that is when contingency planning accelerates. In 2020, reports began to surface about covert efforts to destabilize Maduro's grip. Some were amateur, some were catastrophic. All were deniable. The most infamous was Operation Gideon. A small group of dissidents and foreign contractors attempted an amphibious incursion into Venezuela. The plan, according to its own architects, was to capture Maduro and extract him from the country. It failed within hours. The men were intercepted, some were killed. Others were paraded on television, confessing under duress. 2 Americans were captured. The message from Caracas was clear. We are watching everything. Officially, the US government denied involvement. Unofficially, the incident revealed something far more important, that the idea of removing Maduro had migrated beyond think tanks and into action, even if incompetently. Maduro seized the moment. He framed the failure as proof of constant foreign aggression. He tightened security further. He purged remaining dissent within the military. He expanded intelligence cooperation with foreign allies. And he survived. This is where many narratives stop, portraying Maduro as an embattled dictator clinging to power, while Washington fumes helplessly from afar. That interpretation is incomplete, because the United States did not fail to act. It chose not to cross a final threshold. Airstrikes were discussed, target lists existed, scenarios were wargamed, but Venezuela was not Iraq. It was not Panama. It was not Libya. An airstrike campaign risks civilian catastrophe, regional instability, and direct confrontation with rival powers embedded on Venezuelan soil. Any miscalculation could escalate beyond control. And so pressure replaced force. Sanctions intensified, oil revenue was choked, assets were frozen indefinitely, diplomatic isolation hardened. The objective shifted from removal to containment, and containment has consequences, especially for civilians. Millions more fled Venezuela. The humanitarian crisis deepened. The regime adapted, finding new black market routes, alternative currencies, and informal economies to survive. Maduro did not win, but he did not fall. What this reveals is not just the resilience of a man, but the limitations of modern power. In the 20th century, regime change was often blunt. In the 21st, it is strangled by complexity. Because when adversaries are networked globally, every strike echoes outward. The United States could take Maduro into custody if it accepted the cost. It could authorize airstrikes if it embraced escalation. It chose neither. And that choice exposes a deeper truth. Power today is no longer about what you can destroy, but what you can afford to destabilize. Near the end of every confrontation lies the question that never gets answered publicly. What happens next? Maduro reigns in power, though weaker. Sanctions remain, though selectively relaxed. Negotiations flicker on and off. Elections occur, contested and controlled. The world grows distracted, and yet the files remain open. Because indictments do not expire quietly. Because intelligence agencies do not forget targets. Because unresolved confrontations do not disappear. They pause. Awareness spreads differently than propaganda. This is not the story of a villain or a hero. It is the story of a system that produced a man, elevated him, tried to remove him, and then learned it could not do so cleanly. Nicolás Maduro is not an anomaly. He is a symptom of a post-Cold War disorder, of ideological exhaustion, of a world where legitimacy fractures along geopolitical lines. One country's criminal is another country's ally. One nation's intervention is another nation's invasion. And somewhere between those definitions, civilians live with the consequences. The final uncomfortable consideration is this: if the United States, with all its power, could not decisively remove Nicolás Maduro without risking catastrophic escalation, what does that say about the future of global authority? And how many other leaders now govern, knowing that survival is possible, even when the world wants you gone? The silence after power decides is not peace. It is calculation, and it is still unfolding. There's a moment in every prolonged standoff when force gives way to something quieter. Not resolution, not peace, but normalization. That is where Venezuela now exists. In the gray space where crisis becomes background noise and unfinished confrontations are absorbed into routine diplomacy. Nicolás Maduro still wakes each morning as president, not because legitimacy was restored, but because the world recalibrated its tolerance. This is how power adapts. Behind closed doors, negotiations resumed. Not about justice, not about democracy, but about oil, migration, and leverage. Sanctions were selectively eased, then tightened again, then partially waived. Prisoners were exchanged, elections were observed, criticized, then cautiously acknowledged. The language softened. Authoritarian replaced illegitimate. Dialogue replaced removal. Stability replaced accountability. None of this erased the indictments. None of it cleared the charges. It simply acknowledged something uncomfortable. Nicolás Maduro was still there, and no clean mechanism existed to remove him without destabilizing an already fractured hemisphere. This is where the public narrative diverges sharply from the internal one. Publicly, the United States maintained that all options remained on the table. Privately, planning shifted toward endurance. Because the truth is this: airstrikes do not end systems, they expose them. An air campaign against Venezuela would not have resembled surgical justice. It would have unraveled supply chains, displaced millions more, and risked direct confrontation with foreign forces embedded within the country. It would have ignited nationalism among even those who despised Maduro. It would have turned a corrupt regime into a symbol of resistance. Strategists understand this, which is why pressure became indirect, slow, grinding, financial, and psychological. And Maduro adapted again. He leaned into survival economics. Informal markets flourished. Cryptocurrency mining farms appeared under state protection. Gold flowed out through opaque channels. Fuel shortages were solved not through reform, but through clandestine supply routes. The state shrank, but the regime hardened. At the same time, Maduro refined his role internationally. He positioned himself not as a revolutionary firebrand, but as a necessary interlocutor, a gatekeeper of oil during global shortages, a buffer against uncontrolled migration, a stable authoritarian rather than a collapsing vacuum. This was not charisma, it was endurance. What makes Nicolás Maduro dangerous is not brilliance, but persistence. He outlasted sanctions that were supposed to break him. He survived coup rumors, foreign-backed challenges, and open criminal charges. He learned that time favors those willing to absorb suffering, especially when that suffering is not personally felt. And this forces a final reckoning with the original question: why did the United States get involved so deeply? Not because Maduro was uniquely evil, but because Venezuela alone suffered. Not because Venezuela alone suffered, but because his existence intersected too many red lines at once. Energy control, drug routes, foreign military presence, ideological defiance in a region historically dominated by U.S. influence. Maduro became a convergence point, where criminal allegations, geopolitical rivalry, and symbolic defiance merged into a single target. And yet, he remains, which exposes the most uncomfortable truth of all. Modern power can name enemies. It can isolate them. It can punish them. But removing them cleanly, decisively, without blowback, is becoming increasingly rare. Sorry to interrupt your regularly scheduled podcast, but this episode is brought to you by the Broken Truth merch. Support the show. Wear the truth. Official Broken Truth podcast merch is live now. Links in the description. And since you've made it this far in the episode, comment #BrokenTruth and leave us a 5-star review on your favorite platform. Because when you speak up, the algorithm listens. And so does the world. The era of swift regime change is ending. What replaces it is messier, slower, and morally ambiguous. And in that world, men like Nicolás Maduro do not need to win. They only need to survive. The final silence is not the sound of justice delayed. It is the sound of systems learning their limits. Follow the Broken Truth podcast on the platform you're listening on. Leave us a 5-star review. Share this episode and comment your thoughts below. Because the stories that matter most are the ones still unfolding, quietly, behind closed doors, while the world looks elsewhere. And somewhere in that silence, power is still deciding what it can afford to do next. The most dangerous moment in any confrontation is not when force is used. It is when force is justified, because justification transforms intention into doctrine. By the time Nicolás Maduro was indicted by the United States, the moral groundwork had already been laid years earlier. The language had shifted quietly, from political disagreement to illegitimacy, to criminality. Each step narrowed the space for compromise, and widened the space for coercion. This is where part 2 begins, not with a man, but with a system that decided he was no longer a political problem, but a law enforcement target with geopolitical consequences. In March 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice unsealed charges accusing Nicolás Maduro and senior Venezuelan officials of narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and corruption. The accusations were sweeping. They allege coordination with armed groups, the weaponization of narcotic flows, and the use of state power to position foreign populations. A bounty was attached. This detail matters. Because bounties are not symbolic, they are behavioral signals. They tell intelligence networks, foreign services, informants, and defectors that cooperation is rewarded, and silence is not neutral. Historically, this tactic has been reserved for insurgent leaders, cartel heads, and non-state actors. Maduro was now framed as all three. Officially, the three charges rested on testimony from defectors, intercepted communications, and long-running investigations into regional trafficking networks. Unofficially, the timing raised immediate questions. Why now? Why during a moment of peak vulnerability, global distraction, and economic freefall? One interpretation suggests legal inevitability, that evidence had finally reached prosecutable threshold. Another suggests strategic convergence, that criminal charges were a force multiplier layered atop sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and covert pressure. Both can be true, but neither explains the deeper architecture. Because the narco-terrorism designation did something far more consequential than accuse Maduro of crimes. It collapsed the distinction between sovereign authority and criminal enterprise. And once that distinction collapses, the rules change everywhere. To understand this, you have to understand how modern covert action actually works. Not in films, not in speeches, but in doctrine. The United States does not typically remove leaders because they are corrupt. If that were the standard, intervention would be endless. Removal becomes thinkable only when three conditions converge. First, the leader is framed as a direct threat beyond their borders. Second, internal legitimacy is fractured enough to justify assistance. Third, the international cost of action is assessed as manageable. Venezuela satisfied the first condition through narcotics allegations and regional instability. It satisfied the second through contested elections and humanitarian collapse. It failed the third, because Venezuela was not isolated. In the late 2010s, it had become interlocked with rival power structures. Russian strategic interests were embedded in energy and defense. Chinese financial exposure was significant. Iranian logistical cooperation had become visible. Cuban intelligence influence was pervasive. Any decisive action against Maduro risked entanglement. This is the paradox of modern enforcement. The more connected a regime becomes, the harder it is to remove. And so U.S. strategy leaned into what it does best when force is constrained: systems pressure. Sanctions were no longer simply punitive. They became surgical. Oil exports were targeted, shipping insurance was restricted, secondary sanctions threatened third-party compliance. Financial pathways were monitored, blocked, reopened, and blocked again. The objective was not collapse. It was compliance or fracture. And yet, fracture did not come. What came instead was adaptation. Inside Venezuela, the regime reorganized around survival economics. The formal state shrank. The informal state expanded. Gold mining intensified in remote regions under military oversight. Cryptocurrency operations were quietly tolerated and in some cases protected. Fuel distribution became an instrument of loyalty. Smuggling networks evolved into parallel supply chains. This was not governance, it was endurance engineering. And endurance is easier when pain is externalized. Sanctions did not fall on the elite first. They fell on the population. Medicine shortages, food scarcity, currency collapse, migration waves that reshaped neighboring countries. International pressure mounted, not against Maduro, but against the situation. Suddenly, the conversation shifted. How long could this continue? Who was responsible for civilian suffering? At what point does pressure become cruelty? This is where sanctions reveal their moral ambiguity. They are designed to weaken regimes, but regimes often survive by letting populations absorb the shock. Maduro understood this calculus. He did not need prosperity. He needed endurance longer than his adversary's attention span. And he was right. Meanwhile, in Washington, something else was happening. The doctrine of regime change was being quietly reassessed. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. Each intervention had begun with moral certainty and ended with strategic exhaustion. Each had produced instability that outlived the justification. Venezuela loomed as another potential entry on that list, with even higher regional risk. And so the most aggressive tools remained unused. Airstrikes were modeled, but never authorized publicly. Capture scenarios were evaluated, but never greenlit officially. Covert operations flickered, but none reached critical mass. Instead, the pressure plateaued. This is not failure. It is restraint born of experience. Because modern power has learned something uncomfortable. Removing a leader does not remove the system that produced them. And sometimes, the system that follows is worse. This brings us to the most misrepresented aspect of the Maduro story. The idea that the United States could have removed him easily, but chose not to. That belief misunderstands both capability and consequence. Yes, the United States possesses overwhelming military superiority, but superiority does not equal control. Air dominance does not translate into political legitimacy. Precision strikes do not rebuild states. Every opinion carried cascading risk. Civilian casualties would have hardened nationalist resistance. Foreign military advisors could have triggered escalation. Migration flows would have surged exponentially. Regional governments would have been destabilized. The price of action exceeded the price of endurance, and so a quiet recalibration occurred. Maduro shifted from a target to a problem to be managed. This is the graveyard of revolutionary rhetoric, where grand moral claims dissolve into transactional diplomacy. By the early 2020s, negotiations resumed, indirectly at first, then openly. Prisoners were exchanged, electoral frameworks were discussed, sanctions relief was dangled conditionally. The language softened again, not because Maduro was redeemed, but because reality intervened. Energy markets shifted, global crisis emerged, attention fragmented, and in the background, the indictments remain. Because unresolved legal pressure is a leash, not a weapon. It restricts movement, it shapes alliances, it defines vulnerability. Maduro governs knowing that legitimacy is conditional, survival is temporary, and removal is always conceptually possible, if circumstances change. That awareness shapes behavior. It makes leaders cautious, paranoid, and transactional. It produces regimes that do not seek reform, only survival. So what does Part 2 actually reveal? It reveals that Nicolás Maduro is not the center of the story. He's the surface. The real subject is a global system, struggling to enforce order without unleashing chaos. A system where criminal law, economic warfare, intelligence operations, and diplomacy blur into one continuous pressure field. A system discovering that its tools no longer guarantee outcomes. The uncomfortable consideration is this: if criminal indictment, economic strangulation, diplomatic isolation, covert pressure, and symbolic delegitimization are not enough to remove a leader, what comes next? And what happens when more leaders learn the same lesson Maduro did, that survival, not legitimacy, is the new currency of power? This story does not end with Venezuela. It continues wherever power confronts its own limits and chooses endurance over resolution. There's a final layer to every power confrontation that never makes headlines. It exists beneath law, beneath diplomacy, beneath military planning. It is the layer where enforcement quietly stops, not because the target is innocent, but because the system reaches the edge of what it can control. This is that layer. When a state labels a foreign leader a criminal, it is making a promise to itself, to allies, to history. A promise that accountability will come. But in reality, criminal designation at the sovereign level is less a verdict than a pressure instrument. It is a way to shape behavior, restrict movement, fracture alliances, and signal that legitimacy has been revoked. What it does not guarantee is resolution. Nicolás Maduro discovered this early. The indictments did not end his rule, they changed its geometry. He stopped traveling freely, he hardened internal security, he delegated visibility, he reduced exposure. He learned to govern from behind layers, of intermediaries, of plausible deniability, of controlled opacity. This is what indicted leaders do when they understand the rules. They do not seek redemption, they seek insulation. And insulation is easier to build when enforcement itself is fragmented. The public often assumes that U.S. power is unified, that intelligence agencies, law enforcement, diplomats, and the military act as a single instrument. They do not. They overlap, they compete, and they contradict. This matters enormously in cases like Venezuela. The Department of Justice pursues cases based on evidentiary thresholds. Intelligence agencies assess risk based on exposure and blowback. The Treasury Department weaponizes finance with little regard for judicial outcomes. Diplomats seek leverage, not verdicts. The military prepares options that it is never certain will be used. Each operates within its own logic. And Nicolás Maduro learned to live inside those gaps. The narco-terrorism case, for example, exists in a legal universe that assumes extradition, cooperation, or capture. None of those conditions exist with a sitting head of state protected by loyal security forces and foreign alliances. The intelligence universe, meanwhile, assesses whether capture is feasible without catastrophic escalation. Often, it is not. The diplomatic universe weighs whether pressure advances long-term interests or freezes them. So the system stalls, not from weakness, but from contradiction. This is the hidden truth of modern enforcement. Power can surround a target without ever touching them. There's another misconception worth dismantling. That Venezuela's survival under Maduro proves sanctions don't work. That framing is incomplete. Sanctions work. but not the way the public imagines. They rarely produce collapse, they rarely produce revolt, they rarely produce moral clarity. What they produce is time. Time for pressure to accumulate, time for negotiations to emerge, time for leverage to be traded quietly. In Venezuela's case, sanctions worked precisely as designed. They degraded state capacity, limited revenue, constrained options, and forced dependency. What they did not do was produce regime change, because regime change requires something sanctions cannot provide at all: an internal rupture strong enough to overcome fear. That rupture never came. The military did not split. The intelligence services did not defect en masse. The ruling coalition adjusted rather than fractured. Maduro did not inspire loyalty, but he maintained control. And control is enough. There's an uncomfortable reason why the military did not abandon him. It is not ideology, it is exposure. Years of survival economics entangle institutions and activities that cannot survive transparency. When the cost of defection is prosecution, loyalty becomes rational. This is how systems lock themselves in. Every year that passes without resolution deepens the mutual dependency between leader and apparatus. Removal becomes existential, not political. And external actors know this, which is why the most aggressive scenarios remain theoretical. Airstrikes could cripple infrastructure, but they cannot manufacture legitimacy. Capture operations could succeed tactically, but fail strategically. Covert actions could destabilize, but not reconstruct. Each option solves one problem while multiplying others, and so restraint masquerades as indecision. There's a moment, rarely acknowledged, when great powers quietly accept that a target will not be removed on their timeline. That moment does not come with an announcement. It comes with procedural shifts. Negotiations reopen, language softens, sanctions become conditional, and attention drifts. The story moves from the front page to the policy memo. This is what happened with Venezuela. Maduro did not win. He was absorbed into a category reserved for unresolved problems that are too dangerous to escalate and too entrenched to ignore. This category is growing. And that is the real story. Because Nicolás Maduro is not unique. He is a prototype, a leader who governs under indictment, a state that survives under siege, a regime that adapts faster than the tools designed to break it. And others are watching. They are learning that legitimacy is negotiable, that isolation can be managed, that survival is possible without approval. This knowledge changes the global landscape. It tells future leaders that endurance matters more than reform, that control matters more than consent, that time is a weapon if you can withstand its cost. This is not a moral argument. It is a structural one. And the final question that remains unsolved, and intentionally so: what happens if circumstances change? Because enforcement is not static. Energy markets shift, political leadership cycles, and global crises reorder priorities. The same system that restrained itself yesterday can reassert itself tomorrow. Indictments do not expire quietly. Files are not closed, they are archived. Pressure does not disappear, it waits. Maduro governs knowing this. He knows that the survival depends not on legitimacy, but on relevance, on being useful enough, stable enough, inconvenient enough to leave in place. This is not power as glory. It is power as calculus. If this investigation has clarified how authority truly operates when ideals collide with reality, follow the Broken Truth podcast on the platform you're listening on. Leave us a 5-star review, share this episode, and comment your thoughts below. Because understanding power does not make it disappear, but it does make you harder to manipulate. The story of Nicolás Maduro is not a verdict. It is a warning that the world is entering an era where accountability is selective, enforcement is conditional, and survival is the primary political skill. Where leaders are not removed, they are managed. Where justice is not denied, it is deferred. And where the silence after power decides is not peace. It is a sound of limits being recognized. The silence is spreading, and it is not finished speaking. And now we'll move on to the final official timeline of events for the capture of Maduro and the airstrikes in Venezuela. Before the 2026 operation, throughout 2025, escalation of U.S. pressure on Venezuela. The U.S. government publicly designated elements of the Venezuelan state as involved in narco-terrorism and drug trafficking. Rewards were offered for Maduro's capture. The bounty was increased to $50 million, according to CBS News. A U.S. military buildup occurred in the Caribbean, including deployment of warships, for example, the USS Gerald R. Ford, and fighter aircraft. Again, according to CBS News, the U.S. conducted a series of strikes on maritime drug trafficking targets in the Caribbean, according to The Independent. U.S. officials publicly framed these actions with a broader campaign, sometimes described as Operation Southern Spear, aimed at a counter-drug and destabilizing narco-terror elements, though critics called it a cover for broader military pressure, according to the Council on Foreign Relations. January 3rd, 2026, the official strike and the capture. At 0200 hours Venezuelan time, the U.S. launched a series of coordinated airstrikes across northern Venezuela, focusing on disabling air defenses and military capability around Caracas. These airstrikes involved more than 150 aircraft, including bombers, fighters, surveillance planes, and drones, according to Air and Space Forces magazine. At 0100 hours local time, Special Operations helicopters flew into Caracas with elite ground forces to seize Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, according to Air and Space Forces magazine. By 0329 hours, Maduro and Flores were reportedly aboard the U.S. amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima and en route out of Venezuelan territory, according to Air and Space Forces magazine. At 0425 hours, U.S. President Donald Trump publicly announced the capture and extraction following the military strikes. On the afternoon of January 3rd, Maduro and Flores arrived in the U.S. Stewart Air National Guard Base in New York to face federal charges. Here's the operation name and involved forces. The mission has been referred to in official briefs as Operation Absolute Resolve. Primary U.S. forces involved: the U.S. Army Delta Force Special Operations Capture Force, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, helicopter support for the raid. U.S. Air Force supported airstrikes and aerial reconnaissance. The U.S. Navy provided ship-based assets, including the USS Iwo Jima, which transported Maduro post-capture. The U.S. Marine Corps participated in strike and security components. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and Hostage Rescue Team reportedly integrated for arrest and legal processing. Supporting U.S. agencies, the CIA, NSA, and National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, intelligence, surveillance, and mission planning support. Here's the outcome in the aftermath. Maduro and Celia Flores were captured by U.S. forces and flown to New York to face charges including narco-terrorism and drug trafficking conspiracy. The casualties: at least 2 U.S. soldiers were injured during the operation. Venezuelan military and civilian casualties were reported, with estimates varying. The political impact: Venezuela's vice president and Maduro loyalists demanded proof of life and rejected the legitimacy of the action. International condemnation came from multiple countries, citing sovereignty violation and international law. Venezuelan opposition leaders celebrated the capture and urged transition toward democratic governance. So this leads to quite the open-ended question that is intended to encourage thought. If we, as a country, can go and capture someone else on indicted charges in a different country, why is it that here in the United States, our own political leaders who have also been indicted, various individuals on various charges, are not taken down in a similar fashion? Not with military involvement, but with justice. It begs the question that we have the topic that was brought up recently by Nick Shirley, who exposed hundreds of millions, if not potentially $billions of fraud here in the United States. Now, on many levels, this is being addressed, which is appropriate. But to what extent does this go? So, once again, if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone. There's a lot of wild things going on in this country, and it's important to know what's going on so we know how to proceed moving forward. Leave us a 5-star review, drop your comments below, and until next time, stay awake, stay aware, and stay questioning the narrative.
In a world built on hidden histories and half-truths, we've only just begun to peel back the layers. Because what you've heard tonight was never meant to be known. But you were meant to find it. If you're ready to go deeper, leave us a review, comment your thoughts, share this episode, and step inside the archives. Join the inner circle, where the real evidence is kept. This is the broken truth, because the truth isn't whole it's broken.